The man's voice was a blunt instrument. "Nice shot." A pause hung in the sterile air of the digital range, thick with the smell of ozone and hot metal. "For a girl!" He stood behind her, a mountain of muscle and decorated fatigues. His call sign was Bull, and he wore it like a crown. His shadow fell across her station, a deliberate act of physical dominance. The other operators, a gallery of hardened men, watched. Some smirked, others studied the floor. None met her eyes. She did not turn. Her gaze remained fixed on the primary display, a 1,000-meter representation of a hostile desert valley. The target, a simulated heat signature the size of a fist, still pulsed with the afterimage of her successful hit, a perfect cold-bore shot, a mathematical impossibility for most. Her hands rested on the console, fingers still. Her breathing was even, a slow and measured tide. She was a study in absolute stillness, a predator in repose. In this world of loud noises and explosive action, her silence was a language few understood. Bull took her silence as submission. It was the only way he knew how to interpret it. He stepped closer, his bulk crowding her space, the scent of stale coffee on his breath. "Cat got your tongue, Echo?" he pressed, his voice a low rumble meant to intimidate. "Or did you just get lucky?" She remained a statue carved from ice and discipline. The only thing that moved was her reflection in the dark screen. Her face was plain, unremarkable, framed by dark hair pulled back in a severe, functional knot. There were no decorations on her simple gray fatigues, no rank insignia, no unit patches. She was an anomaly, a ghost in their machine, an expert consultant brought in to calibrate their new long-range sensor suites. To the men in this room, she was an unwelcome variable. To Bull, she was an insult. He saw a small woman. He saw a quiet technician. He did not see the weapon sitting before him. It was a failure of perception that would cost him dearly. Finally, after a silence that stretched thin and tight like a garrote wire, she moved. It was not a flinch. It was not a start. It was a deliberate, economical turn of her head. Her eyes, the color of a winter sea, met his. They held no anger. They held no fear. They held nothing but a calm, analytical light, as if she were measuring the structural weaknesses in a piece of steel. Her voice, when it came, was low and clear. It did not carry emotion. It carried weight. "Instructor," she said, her tone as flat as the horizon. "Permission to fire the sequence again." Bull chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "Think you can repeat a miracle, sweetheart? The atmospheric variables have already shifted. The polymorphic signal drift is—" She cut him off, not by raising her voice, but by the sheer, undeniable force of her next words. "Blindfolded." The word landed in the center of the room and detonated. The smirks on the faces of the operators vanished, replaced by slack-jawed disbelief. Even Bull was momentarily silenced. He stared at her, searching for the punchline, for the sign of a joke. He found none. Her expression was utterly serious, a mask of professional focus. One of the other operators, a man called Watchman, leaned forward slightly. Unlike the others, he had not smirked. He had been observing her since she arrived, noting the way she moved, the way she analyzed schematics, the way her eyes missed nothing. He was the first to sense that the power dynamic in the room was not what it appeared to be. He recognized the quiet hum of a finely tuned engine waiting to engage. Bull recovered, his ego reasserting itself like a physical reflex. He saw it as a bluff, a desperate gambit from an out-of-her-depth technician trying to save face. He would call it. He would break her. "You want to go again?" he boomed, playing to his audience. "You want to waste another $1 million simulated munition? Fine." He grinned, a predator's smile. "You want to do it blindfolded? Be my guest. Let's see this party trick." He gestured to one of the support staff. "Get her a blindfold." She did not wait. Echo reached into a small pouch on her belt and produced a simple strip of black cloth. It was worn, familiar. She had done this before. This was not a party trick. This was a ritual. She wrapped the cloth around her eyes, her movements practiced and sure. The world went dark, but for her, it only brought the important things into focus. The low-frequency hum of the facility's power core, the subtle vibration of the cooling fans in the console, the whisper of the ventilation system. She did not see with her eyes. she saw with data. The range was more than a visual interface. It was a torrent of information, a river of numbers she could read with her fingertips and her ears. The system fed haptic feedback through the controls, subtle vibrations that spoke of wind shear and barometric pressure. It translated signal degradation into barely audible changes in the system's resonant frequency. These were senses the men around her, men like Bull, had never learned to use. They relied on their eyes, their scopes, their visual confirmation. They saw the target. She understood the physics that governed the path to it. She placed her hands back on the controls. She took a single, deep breath, held it, and then let it out slowly, her entire being sinking into a state of profound concentration. The quiet in the room was now absolute. It was the quiet of a congregation waiting for a sermon or an execution. Her discipline had been forged in fire and loss. It was a shield built around a core of memory. She was the daughter of a ghost, a man whose legend was whispered in classified briefing rooms and redacted after-action reports. He had been a pioneer, a master of signal intelligence and electronic warfare. He did not command armies. He commanded the spectrum itself. He had raised her not as a daughter, but as an apprentice. Her bedtime stories were not fairy tales. They were lectures on wave propagation theory and the cryptographic principles of secure networks. Her playground was not a park. It was a workshop filled with dismantled radios, custom-built antennas, and oscilloscopes that painted green light across her face. He taught her that the nature of modern conflict was changing. The future would not be won by the man with the strongest arm, but by the one with the clearest signal. He taught her that the most powerful weapon in any arsenal was a perfectly disciplined mind, one that could filter noise and find the single, critical thread of data in a storm of chaos. He taught her about stillness. The predator that makes the most noise is the first to starve, he would say, his voice a quiet rasp. The true hunter is the one the prey never sees, never hears, never suspects is there at all. She had absorbed these lessons as a plant absorbs sunlight. They were part of her cellular structure. She excelled, moving past his knowledge and into realms of her own. She could hear the minute variations in a satellite's handshake protocol, identifying its country of origin by the specific dialect of its code. She could feel the ghost of a hidden network by the way it subtly warped the ambient electronic field. Her skills were singular, elite, and utterly invisible to the uninitiated. Then came the day that transformed his lessons from philosophy into a vow. It was a mission deep in a contested territory, a recovery operation gone wrong. Her father was providing overwatch, his role to keep the team's communication lines clean and secure. She was 16, monitoring a secondary feed from a remote station thousands of miles away. A silent apprentice listening to the masters at work. The team leader on the ground was a man much like Bull. He was loud, decorated, and supremely confident in his own experience. He was a warrior of the old school, a man who trusted his gut and the strength of the men at his back. Her father's voice had come over the secure channel, calm and precise. Hold position. I have a polymorphic signal masking a secondary unit. They're baiting you into a kill zone. I repeat, hold position. The team leader's reply was laced with contempt. We have eyes on the objective, Ghost. We're not sitting back on the word of a radio jockey. The data is clear, her father insisted. The geometry of the ambush is perfect. Do not advance. We're moving, the team leader had snarled, and then he had cut the channel. She had watched it unfold in a cascade of horrifying data points. She saw the team's biometric sensors spike as the trap was sprung. She saw their communication signals fragment and then scream into static. And she heard it. Through a sliver of bandwidth he had managed to keep open, a channel just for her. She heard the last transmission from her father. It was not a word. It was the electronic shriek of his equipment failing, the sound of his life support system being torn apart. A final, agonizing burst of noise that was imprinted on her soul. He had died because of ego, because a man in a position of authority had mistaken arrogance for strength and had refused to listen to the quiet truth of the data. Section. In the aftermath, she had made a promise to his memory. She would never allow ego to dictate outcomes. She would honor his legacy by embodying his philosophy. She would become the quiet professional. She would master the stillness. She would let her competence be her only voice. Every mission, every calibration, Every moment like this one, in a room full of arrogant men, was a fulfillment of that vow. Now, blindfolded in the digital range, she was not just a technician proving a point. She was a priestess performing a sacred rite. Her fingers danced across the console. She was not aiming a weapon. She was tuning an instrument. She adjusted the gain on the acoustic sensor feed, listening for the telltale hiss of the simulated wind patterns in the target valley. A subtle shift in pitch told her the wind speed had increased by 3 knots, gusting from a new vector. She felt the haptic feedback in the control yoke, a faint, rhythmic tremor. It was the digital ghost of the Earth's rotation, the Coriolis effect, a factor so minuscule that 99% of operators ignored it. She did not. She compensated for it, a micro-adjustment of less than 1,000th of a degree. She focused on the polymorphic signal Bull had mentioned, the scrambling frequency designed to mimic background noise and defeat targeting sensors. To him, it was an obstacle. To her, it was a roadmap. The signal had a pattern, a repeating algorithmic structure. It had a heartbeat. She listened to it, synchronized her own system's refresh rate with its pulse, and in that infinitesimally small gap between the signal's waves, she found a pocket of perfect clarity, a silence within the noise. It was an impossible calculation, a feat of mental and technical dexterity that bordered on precognition. She did not rush. She did not fear. She did not doubt. She breathed in. She found the moment of equilibrium. She pressed the firing stud. For a full second, nothing happened. The only sound was the hum of the machines. Bull started to form a triumphant, condescending smirk. Then, the screen flashed. A single word appeared in stark white letters over the target area. Impact. The room was utterly silent. The men stared at the screen, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. It was not just a successful shot. The telemetry data began to scroll on a secondary monitor. Target acquisition time, 0.8 seconds. Solution calculation, 1.2 seconds. Margin of error, 0.00 millimeters. It was not a shot. It was an act of surgical perfection. It was a statement. She reached up with one hand and slowly, deliberately, pulled the blindfold from her eyes. She blinked once, her vision adjusting to the light. Her expression was unchanged. There was no triumph, no satisfaction. There was only the quiet calm of a task completed. She turned her head and looked at Bull. The man's face was a mask of stunned disbelief. The color had drained from it, leaving a pasty gray pallor. His arrogance had been stripped away, layer by layer, by a quiet woman with a blindfold. He was exposed, his authority a hollow shell. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he say? He had been publicly, clinically, and undeniably proven a fool. Watchman let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was a small, humorless sound of profound respect. He knew he had just witnessed something legendary. The moment was shattered by a piercing alarm. It was a sound no one in that room had ever heard outside of a high-level simulation. It was the facility's core security alert, a wail that signified a total system compromise. Simultaneously, the lights in the command center flickered and died, plunging them into the cold, emergency red of the backup lighting. The main display screen dissolved into a blizzard of static, then reformed into a single, pulsing icon. A stylized black wolf, its eyes glowing with malevolent code. "What is that?" someone yelled. "It's not a drill," another voice shouted. "Comms are down. I'm locked out of the network." Bull reacted on instinct, his training kicking in. He began to bark orders. "Get on the hard lines. Try to reboot the central server. Security teams, seal the exits. This is a lockdown." His voice was loud, authoritative, but it was the authority of a bygone era. He was giving orders for a physical assault, a brute force response. He was trying to fight a ghost with a club. The black wolf icon on the screen seemed to mock him. The facility's automated systems, once their tools, were now their enemies. The operators could hear the heavy thud of magnetic locks slamming shut all around them. The low hum of the defensive turrets in the ceiling changed pitch as they swiveled online, their optical sensors glowing with the same red as the emergency lights. They were trapped. They were being hunted by their own fortress. Panic, cold and sharp, began to cut through the discipline of the operators. Bull's orders became more frantic, more useless. He was shouting at screens that would not respond, at systems that no longer recognized his authority, his physical power, his rank, his reputation. They were all meaningless. He was a giant, raging against the tide. Watchmen ignored him. His eyes were locked on Echo. She had not moved. While the room descended into chaos, she remained a point of absolute stillness at its center. Her eyes were scanning the corrupted display, but she was not looking at the icon. She was reading the static behind it, the subtle decay patterns in the signal. She was analyzing the enemy. Her face was a mask of intense concentration. She saw the polymorphic nature of the attack, the way it constantly shifted its signature to evade detection. It was elegant, sophisticated, and brutally effective. It was a work of art, and she recognized the artist's signature. It was a variant of a digital weapon she had only seen once before, in the shredded data fragments recovered from her father's last mission. It was a ghost from her past, a more lethal, more evolved version of the code that had killed him. This was not random. This was personal. Her stillness broke. She moved with a fluid purpose that was mesmerizing to watch. She bypassed the main console, the one Bull was still uselessly pounding on, and went to a small secondary terminal in the corner of the room. It was an older model, a diagnostic station Bull had dismissed as obsolete. To her, it was a back door. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her touch light and impossibly fast. She was not typing commands. She was writing code on the fly, building a digital scalpel to carve her way into the infected system. "What are you doing?" Bull demanded, striding over to her. "I gave you an order. Get away from that terminal." She did not look up. She did not acknowledge him. Her focus was absolute. Her world had shrunk to the screen and the flow of data beneath her fingertips. "That's an order, technician," he roared, reaching out to grab her shoulder. "Don't!" A voice cut through the noise. It was Watchman. He had moved to stand between Bull and her, his hand resting on the sidearm holstered at his hip. His face was grim. "Let her work." Bull stared at him, bewildered. "Are you insane? We are under attack." "Yes," Watchman said, his eyes never leaving the larger man. "And she is the only one here fighting back." The ceiling-mounted turrets began to cycle, their barrels lowering to acquire targets within the room. A cold, synthesized voice echoed through the space. Defensive protocol engaged, hostile biological signatures detected. Their own defenses were about to execute them. On the screen, Echo was deep inside the enemy code. It was a labyrinth, a digital fortress of shifting walls and logical traps. She moved through it with the grace of a phantom, not breaking down doors, but finding the seams, the invisible cracks in its foundation. She found the core logic, the heart of the wolf. It was protected by a layer of cryptographic security so advanced it was theoretically unbreakable. A brute force attack would take centuries. Bull's approach would have been like trying to demolish a mountain with a hammer. But she was not there to demolish it. She was there to communicate with it. She initiated a protocol her father had designed, a theoretical concept he had called the resonant handshake. It was a counterintuitive piece of digital diplomacy. Instead of attacking the enemy code, her program began to mimic it. It copied its signature, its frequency, its very essence. It began to sing the wolf's own song. For a terrifying moment, it seemed to make things worse. The red lights on the turret sensors locked on, the final targeting solution just a microsecond from completion. The men in the room braced for the end. But Echo was calm. She was having a conversation. The enemy code, designed to repel any external attack, did not know how to react to something that looked and felt exactly like itself. It paused. It faltered. In that moment of hesitation, her program offered a handshake, a packet of data that was not a weapon, but a question. The wolf's logic, faced with a perfect mirror of itself, had to choose, integrate or reject. In its confusion, it chose to integrate. It opened the door, and she was in. The instant the connection was made, her scalpel became a sword. She did not try to delete the hostile code. She did something far more elegant. She isolated it, wrapped it in a layer of its own logic, and turned its core command to attack and control inward on itself. The wolf began to devour its own tail. On the main screen, the icon flickered violently. The cascading lines of malicious code began to collapse, folding in on themselves like a dying star. One by one, the red lights on the turrets blinked out. The targeting hum ceased. The magnetic locks on the doors disengaged with a heavy clang. The main lights flickered back on, washing the room in a clean white glare. Silence. The only sound was the soft clicking of Echo's keyboard. She wasn't finished. She had not just defeated the attack. She had captured it. The attacker's digital signature, its point of origin, its entire toolkit. It was all neatly packaged in a secure file on her terminal. She had turned a catastrophic assault into a perfect intelligence windfall. She typed one final command: execute. A new message appeared on the main screen, replacing the static. System secure. Threat neutralized. She leaned back in her chair, the first sign of fatigue touching her features. She had been holding her breath for the entire 2-minute engagement. She let it out in a long, slow sigh. The operators stared, their faces a mixture of awe, confusion, and a dawning, profound respect. They had been passengers on a ship in a hurricane, and this quiet, unassuming woman had been the captain who had single-handedly steered them through the storm. Bull stood frozen, his face ashen. He had been loud. He had been useless. He had been a liability. In the face of a real crisis, his authority, built on bluster and physicality, had crumbled to dust. He was a relic, and he knew it. The debriefing was held less than an hour later via a secure holographic link. The face of the institutional authority, a 4-star general with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of nations, filled the center of the room. He looked severe, his expression carved from granite. "Report," he commanded, his voice rumbling with restrained fury. Bull, his uniform looking suddenly ill-fitting, stepped forward. He had regained some of his composure, but it was a brittle facade. He began to speak, his words carefully chosen to reframe the narrative, to paint himself as the hero. "General, we were hit by an unknown hostile entity. I initiated lockdown protocols and implemented an aggressive containment strategy. My actions created a tactical opening which the civilian specialist," he said, gesturing vaguely at Echo, "was able to exploit to neutralize the threat. It was a masterful piece of self-serving fiction. He was trying to claim her victory as a consequence of his failed leadership." The general's eyes narrowed. He looked past Bull, his gaze settling on Echo, who stood silently at the back of the room. "Specialist, your report." She did not offer a verbal counter-argument. She did not need to. She simply stepped forward to her terminal and, with a few keystrokes, initiated a playback. The main screen split into multiple windows. One showed a complete chronological log of the system's data during the attack. Another displayed every command entered from every terminal. A third window showed the biometric data of every person in the room, retrieved from their mandatory physiological monitors. The data was cold. It was clinical. It was irrefutable. It showed Bull's commands being rejected by the system. It showed his heart rate spiking to 180 beats per minute, his galvanic skin response indicating extreme panic. Then, it showed her data. Her keystrokes were a blur of perfect syntax. Her commands were the only ones the system accepted, and her biometric line was almost perfectly flat. Her heart rate had never risen above 72 beats per minute. In the heart of the crisis, she had been as calm as a meditating monk. The playback finished. The truth hung in the silent room, undeniable and absolute. The general was silent for a long time. His eyes were fixed on the screen, on the stark contrast between the two biometric readouts. One was a jagged mountain range of panic. The other was a serene level plain of pure competence. When he finally spoke, his voice was like the cracking of a glacier. He did not address Echo. He addressed Bull. "Your command is revoked, effective immediately. You will be reassigned. Your new post will be at an educational facility, where you will spend the next year studying the fundamentals of cyber warfare. Perhaps there you will learn the difference between giving orders and being a leader." He paused, letting the weight of the public humiliation settle. "You are a relic, son. The nature of the battlefield has changed. You failed to change with it. Dismissed." Bull stood ramrod straight, his face bloodless. He rendered a stiff, formal salute, turned on his heel, and walked out of the command center. The doors slid shut behind him, closing on the end of his career. The general's holographic form then turned its full attention to Echo. The hardness in his eyes softened, replaced by a look of profound, almost reverent respect. "Your father was a great man," he said, his voice now quiet, personal. "He would be proud." He did not call her Echo. He did not call her specialist. He said, "Well done, Ghost." He was acknowledging her legacy. He was passing the torch. She responded with a single small nod. It was all the acknowledgement she needed. The hologram faded, leaving the room in a new kind of quiet. It was not the tense, challenging quiet from before the crisis. It was a quiet born of respect, of a fundamental reordering of their world. The operators looked at her not as an outsider, but as their savior. The loud, arrogant culture of the unit had been broken, replaced by the dawning understanding of a deeper truth. Watchman walked over to her, his expression one of weary admiration. "I've never seen anything like that," he said, his voice low. "It was a data problem," she replied simply. "It required a data solution." "And the blindfold?" he asked, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "Was that a data solution too?" She looked at him, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than pure analysis appeared in her winter sea eyes. It was the ghost of a memory, the echo of her father's lessons. "Noise," she said. "Sometimes you have to shut out the noise to see clearly." She turned and walked towards the exit, her work there finished. Her footsteps made almost no sound on the polished floor. The story of that day became a legend within the institution. The complete recording of the incident, stripped of classified data, was turned into a core module for all command candidates. It was known as the Echo Protocol. It was a cautionary tale, a brutal lesson in the dangers of ego and the tactical liability of prejudice. It taught a new generation of warriors that true strength was not measured in the volume of a voice or the size of a man's shoulders. It was measured in discipline. It was measured in competence. It was measured in the profound power of a quiet professional who could see the truth when everyone else was blinded by the light. The hardest fight, the protocol taught, was not against the enemy you could see. It was the fight against the enemy within, the pride, the arrogance, and the foolish assumption that you already had all the answers. It was a lesson written in the calm, steady heartbeat of a woman who faced down a storm and did not even flinch.